The manuals that circulated among Europe's professional executioners in the 16th century were not crude instruction sheets. They were technical documents, precise and methodological, filled with anatomical diagrams that mapped the human body the way an engineer maps a machine. Muscle groups were labeled, angles were noted, the neck, the wrist, the spine. Each was broken down into its component parts and studied for the specific mechanical properties that made it valuable. These men were not improvising. They were working from a body of inherited knowledge that had been refined across generations, and the diagrams they consulted treated death as a problem with a correct solution. If you want to understand what really went on behind the scaffold, stay with me. And if this kind of history is what you're here for, consider subscribing. At the center of our professional culture was what the manuals consistently returned to: the clean strike. The phrase appears across multiple traditions and multiple languages, always carrying the same weight. A clean strike meant efficiency, but it also meant something harder to quantify, a kind of craft pride that ran through the entire occupation. Executioners recorded the physics of their work in private ledgers with the same seriousness a military engineer brought to ballistics. The mass of the blade, the arc of a swing, and the precise angle at which steel met the vertebrae. These were not abstract considerations. They were the variables a professional spent years learning to control, and the ledgers show men who took that control seriously enough to write it down. What those private records reveal is a professional world almost entirely disconnected from the spectacle unfolding around it. The crowd that gathered at a public execution came for theatre, which was the noise, the drama, and the cathartic release of watching justice performed on a body. The executioner standing at the center of that theatre was operating from an entirely different set of concerns. His ledgers record timing, blade maintenance, and the physical condition of the condemned. The crowd's hunger for prolonged performance was a logistic complication, not a creative brief. The gap between what the audience witnessed and what the practitioner was actually managing in those moments is one of the stranger distances in the history of professional labor. The shift happened gradually, but it was deliberate. At some point in the 16th century, the men who carried out public executions in Europe began to understand their occupation differently, and they began to present it differently to the institutions that employed them. The title of executioner stopped being simply a designation and became something closer to a credential. These men petitioned for formal recognition, negotiated contracts with municipal authorities, and argued for the kind of legal protection that skilled tradesmen enjoyed. They were not redefining themselves out of vanity. They were responding to a demand from the state, which needed the theater of public punishment to carry authority, and authority required the appearance of expertise. The apprenticeship system that developed around this professional identity was serious and long. A young man entering the trade, often the son or nephew of an established executioner, since the occupation tended to run in family lines, could expect to stand years in a subordinate role before being trusted with independent work. The endpoint of that training was a formal demonstration, sometimes called a masterpiece in direct parallel with a guild tradition, in which the apprentice was required to perform a specific technique before witnesses to a standard that could be assessed and judged. The records that survive from German and French jurisdictions describe this assessment in procedural language that mirrors the documentation of any other skilled trade examination. Failure had consequences. Certification had value. The tools these men maintained were the physical expression of their professional identity. Swords used for beheading were kept to exacting standards, the edge regularly inspected, the balance monitored, and the blade cleaned and restored with care that went well beyond basic upkeep. Ropes used in hanging were selected for specific properties of weight and texture and replaced on a schedule rather than when they showed visible wear. The rack, the wheel, the various instruments used in the more extended forms of judicial punishment that the period required were each governed by accumulated knowledge about how they performed under working conditions. A poorly maintained tool did not just risk a botched execution, it threatened the entire professional argument these men had built. That what happened on the scaffold was controlled, intentional, and administered by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The executioner occupied a position in 16th century European society that had no real equivalent. He was employed by the state, paid from public funds, granted a formal title, and given legal authority to carry out sentences that the law itself had decreed. Without him, the entire apparatus of criminal justice stalled. Municipal records from German and French cities show that when an executioner died without a replacement ready, authorities wrote urgent letters across jurisdictions trying to borrow one. The need was not in question. What was in question was whether anyone who fulfilled that need could be treated as a normal member of the community, and the answer, almost universally, was no. Executioners were required in many cities to live at the edge of the town, near the gallows or the slaughterhouse, away from the residential center. They wore distinctive clothing, often red in the German tradition, not as a mark of honor, but as a warning. People crossed the street to avoid physical contact. Tradesmen sometimes refused even to sell to them directly. The hereditary nature of the occupation compounded everything, because the social contamination associated with the role extended to family members. Executioners found it nearly impossible to marry their children into ordinary households. The practical solution was to marry within the network of other executioner families, which existed across regions and maintained contact precisely for this reason. Sons entered the trade not always by choice, but because the alternatives were genuinely limited. A boy born into an executioner's household carried the association regardless of what he did, and the formal apprenticeship that followed was in many cases less a vocational decision and an acknowledgement of what the world had already decided for him. The psychological literature on hereditary occupational trauma did not exist in the 16th century, but the phenomenon it would eventually describe was operating fully in these family ties. Men performing work they may not have chosen within an identity they could not exit. The rituals these men developed to manage the boundary between their working and domestic lives were specific and consistent enough across regions to suggest they answered a genuine psychological need. Washing rituals after executions were documented in personal records and in the observations of contemporaries. Not the ordinary cleaning that any physical labor requires, but extended, deliberate acts of cleansing that carried the clear weight of symbolic separation. Some executioners changed clothes entirely before entering their homes. Others kept the implements of their trade in outbuildings and refused to bring them across the domestic threshold. Religious observance served a similar function, with several documented cases of executioners who were notably devout and who used the structure of confession and absolution as a regular mechanism for processing what they had done in their professional capacity. These were not irrational behaviors. They were functional adaptations developed by people living under a form of psychological pressure that their society acknowledged through stigma but offered no formal language to describe. Thank you for watching. Until the next one.